3 years ago, the entire United States military believed that the legendary sniper Evelyn Cross had died in an ambush after eliminating dozens of targets to save her teammates. Her body was never recovered, but her name was carved into the Wall of Honored Fallen at Fort Ridgeline. Then, during a top-secret operation, when an entire Special Forces unit found itself surrounded with only minutes left before total annihilation, a single shot rang out from a distance of more than 4 kilometers, just one bullet. And every soldier still breathing on that mountain understood, in the space of a single heartbeat, something that should have been impossible. Evelyn Cross was still alive. The mountains of Black Ridge were buried under snow so deep that even the wind seemed to move slower, as if the cold itself had learned patience. Delta Team advanced through the pass in single file, rifles low, breath fogging in front of pale faces, moving toward a research outpost where a captured scientist named Alan Whitfield was supposedly being held by hostile forces. The intelligence had come from a source considered reliable for years, confirmed twice, cross-checked by 2 separate agencies, and stamped with the kind of confidence that made commanders sleep at night. That confidence was a lie. The moment Delta crossed the ridge line into the valley, the world exploded into gunfire from 3 directions at once, and Commander Marcus Hale understood within seconds that his team had walked into a kill box built with surgical precision. Men dropped into the snow, some rolling for cover behind boulders, others simply falling and not moving again. The radio in Hale's ear screamed with overlapping voices, contact reports, casualty counts, requests for extraction that had no chance of arriving in time. He pressed his back against a frozen outcrop, blood already darkening the snow beside him, and for one brief, involuntary moment, his mind returned to a name he had not allowed himself to think about in a long time. He said it quietly, almost to himself, words meant for no one and everyone. If Ghost were still alive, he murmured, none of this would be happening the way it is happening now. The younger soldiers around him did not understand the reference, but the older ones, the 3 or 4 who had served long enough, went very still when they heard it, because they all knew exactly who Ghost had been. Ghost was Evelyn Cross, and before that name became a rumor and a memory, it had been the single most feared designation on any battlefield the modern military had ever recorded. She was, without dispute, without argument, without a challenger who had ever come close, the finest sniper the armed forces had produced in a generation. Her confirmed kill count remained classified, but the number that leaked years earlier into training manuals was still referenced by instructors who had never met her, a benchmark so far beyond ordinary skill that new recruits assumed it must be exaggerated. It was not exaggerated. Nobody who served beside her ever described her performance as luck. They described it as inevitability, the sense that once Evelyn Cross had eyes on a target, that target's fate had already been decided minutes before the trigger was ever pulled. The story of her death had become something close to scripture within the unit, repeated at ceremonies, referenced in training halls, spoken of in the hushed tone reserved for sacrifice too large to fully explain. 3 years earlier, on a mission that bore an unsettling resemblance to the disaster now unfolding around Commander Hale, her team had been caught in a similarly engineered trap deep in hostile territory. The order to retreat had come down clearly, and every soldier under her command had begun to pull back through a narrow mountain corridor while enemy forces closed from 2 sides. Evelyn had not moved with them. She had taken position instead on an exposed ridge that offered a clear line of fire across the entire withdrawal route. Understanding with total clarity what remaining there would cost her, her voice had come through the radio one final time, steady in a way that unsettled even hardened men who thought nothing could unsettle them anymore. "Go," she had said. "I will hold them here." There had been no tremor in it, no plea for someone to stay behind with her, no request at all beyond that simple instruction delivered like an order rather than a sacrifice. The team had obeyed, because that was what years of trust had trained them to do, and because arguing with Evelyn Cross in the middle of a firefight had never once ended with anyone changing her mind. Gunfire had continued behind them as they withdrew, sharp and rhythmic at first, then scattered, then finally silent in a way that felt far too final to be anything but conclusion. The radio had gone dead somewhere in the minutes that followed, and no signal, no transmission, no static burst of any kind had ever come from her position again. Search teams combed that ridge for 4 days once conditions allowed, working through snow and wreckage and the debris of a battle that had clearly been ferocious even by the standards of that unforgiving valley. They found spent casings scattered across a wide radius, evidence of a defense that had held far longer than any single operator should have been able to sustain, but they never found her. Command issued the only classification the evidence seemed to support, the 2 letters that ended arguments and closed files: killed in action. A name was submitted for the Wall of Honored Fallen. A ceremony was held, and an entire generation of soldiers who came after her learned about ghosts the way people learn about legends, second-hand, reverent, and absolutely certain that the story was finished. 3 years passed with that certainty never once disturbed, until the snow of Black Ridge turned red beneath a different unit, on a different mountain, facing a trap that felt disturbingly familiar to anyone who had studied the old after-action reports closely enough. Nobody in Delta Team that day had reason to expect anything other than a slow, grinding death in a valley chosen specifically because it offered no cover and no clean withdrawal. Commander Hale had said Ghost's name out of desperation rather than hope, a reflex born from exhaustion rather than any real expectation that saying it might change anything at all. He had no way of knowing that somewhere above the tree line, watching through an optic that had not been used in anger for 3 long years, a woman the world believed dead was already calculating windage. The ambush tightened with mechanical efficiency in the minutes that followed the first contact, and it became clear almost immediately that the enemy commanders had planned this encounter with far more care than a routine engagement typically warranted. Nobody stumbles into a kill zone this precise by accident, one of the surviving sergeants muttered while dragging a wounded man behind a low stone wall. And nobody responded because there was nothing reassuring left to say. Drones circled overhead in patient loops, feeding targeting data to mortar teams positioned on the high ground, while armored vehicles rolled slowly along the only 2 routes that might have offered an escape. Somewhere farther back, hidden among the rocks with a discipline that suggested professional training rather than improvised defense, an enemy sniper waited for a clean shot at anyone wearing rank insignia. Search and Rescue 3 years earlier had documented 3 competing theories about what happened to Evelyn Cross after the radio went silent, and none of them had ever been confirmed because no evidence existed to confirm or deny any of them. Some analysts believed she had been caught in the explosive charges she was known to carry for exactly this kind of last stand, vaporized in an instant that left nothing behind for search teams to recover. Others pointed to the sheer volume of snowfall that hit the region within hours of the battle, theorizing that an avalanche had buried her position, along with any physical trace of what happened there. A smaller, quieter faction within intelligence circles had always suspected she might have been captured, though that theory had been dismissed publicly because no ransom demand, no propaganda video, no proof of life had ever surfaced in 3 years of silence. Nobody truly knew, and after enough time passed, the question stopped mattering to anyone except the handful of people who had loved her as a soldier and a friend. Back in the present, on the mountain now called Black Ridge, for reasons that would soon feel painfully appropriate, Delta Team's situation deteriorated with a speed that left almost no room for improvisation. Every avenue of retreat had been sealed within the first 20 minutes of contact, the drone's tracking movement with a persistence that suggested a controller who understood exactly how Special Forces teams tried to break contact under pressure. Mortar rounds walked closer with each volley, forcing the surviving soldiers into an ever-shrinking pocket of rock and frozen earth that offered diminishing protection with every passing minute. A young private named Daniel Reyes, barely 2 years into his service and still carrying the wide-eyed intensity of someone who had trained for this moment without ever truly believing it would arrive, said the words that everyone else had been thinking but refusing to speak aloud. "We are finished," he said quietly, staring at the encroaching enemy vehicles with an expression that had already begun to accept the outcome. Commander Hale did not answer him, because for the first time in a career built on composure under fire, he had nothing left to offer his men except silence and the grim mathematics of a battle they were losing. It was in that exact moment, with an enemy sniper adjusting his scope onto Commander Hale's exposed shoulder and mortar teams preparing what everyone assumed would be the final coordinated barrage, that the mountain answered a question nobody had thought to ask aloud. A single shot cracked across the valley with a sound different from anything the men huddled below had heard that day. Sharper, more distant, arriving almost a full second after the muzzle flash would have occurred somewhere impossibly far away. The enemy sniper, mid-breath, mid-calculation, simply stopped existing as a threat. dropping instantly from his position without ever completing the shot that should have ended Marcus Hale's life. For a long moment nobody moved, nobody spoke, because the physics of what had just happened did not align with anything a battlefield was supposed to allow. A communications specialist attached to the unit, a meticulous young man named Peter Okafor, who had spent years studying ballistics as a hobby before it became his profession, immediately pulled up terrain data and began calculating the geometry of the shot with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline and disbelief. He worked through the numbers twice before speaking, cross-referencing elevation, distance, and the angle at which the enemy sniper had fallen, because the answer his instruments were giving him felt too absurd to report without verification. When he finally looked up, his voice carried the particular flatness of a man reporting something his training told him was impossible. 4,183 meters, he said. That is the distance to the only ridgeline with a clean angle on that position, and nobody makes a shot like that. Commander Hale, still pressed against frozen rock, with his heart hammering from a death he had narrowly avoided, said nothing at all, because a memory had already begun forming in the back of his mind that felt too impossible to voice. Another soldier, older, a grizzled staff sergeant named Robert Kessler, who had served 3 tours before most of the men around him had finished basic training, spoke the words that everyone else had been afraid to say first. Only one person that any of them had ever heard of had made shots like that under combat conditions, at that range, in weather this unforgiving, with a target this small and this fast-moving. Every head on that frozen slope turned slowly toward the ridgeline above them, searching for movement that was never going to reveal itself, because whoever had just fired that shot clearly had no intention of being seen. Marcus Hale felt something shift inside his chest that he could not immediately name. A mixture of disbelief and something dangerously close to hope, because the only name that fit that description belonged to a woman whose grave marker had no body underneath it. Ghost, someone finally whispered, and the word traveled through the huddled survivors like a current, because every one of them understood exactly what it meant if that whisper turned out to be true. Kessler had served alongside Evelyn Cross for 2 full deployments before her supposed death, and he was the only man on that mountain who had actually watched her work at close range, who understood in his bones rather than merely through rumor what she was capable of under pressure. He remembered a training exercise years earlier when instructors had set up a target at a distance considered near the theoretical maximum for her rifle platform, expecting most candidates to miss entirely and the best among them to land perhaps 1 round in 5. Evelyn had put 4 consecutive rounds through a target smaller than a dinner plate, adjusting for wind and mirage between each shot with a calm that had made even veteran instructors go quiet with respect. Watching the enemy sniper drop an impossible distance away, Kessler felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight with dread only seconds earlier, because he recognized the signature of that shot the way another man might recognize a familiar handwriting on an old letter. What followed across the next several hours became something that battlefield historians would later study for years, though none of them would ever fully agree on how to describe it accurately. No one on that mountain ever saw her, not once, not even for a fraction of a second through a scope or a drone feed or a thermal camera sweep, and yet her presence became undeniable through the pattern of destruction that unfolded around the trapped soldiers. Enemy snipers positioned at 3 separate elevations simply stopped reporting in, one after another. Each silence followed eventually by the discovery of a body that had been placed with a single shot fired from a position no one could locate afterward. Reconnaissance drones providing the enemy's targeting data began falling from the sky at intervals too regular to be coincidence, their controllers reporting sudden loss of signal followed by confirmed wreckage on the ground below. A forward radar station that had been coordinating the mortar barrage went silent within the hour, its antenna array shattered by what technicians later determined, upon recovering the site, had been a single armor-piercing round fired from a distance that defied every published specification for the rifle platform believed responsible. There was no radio chatter from whoever was doing this, no attempt at communication, no demand, no signal of any kind sent to the trapped soldiers to indicate help had arrived or coordinate a response with them. There were only the bullets, arriving with a precision and a patience that made clear this was not panic or improvisation but a methodical dismantling of every system the enemy had built to guarantee Delta Team's destruction. The enemy commander overseeing the operation, a hardened officer accustomed to controlling every variable on his battlefields, began screaming into his own radio network with an urgency that betrayed how quickly his confidence was collapsing. "Find her," he ordered his subordinates, again and again, his voice climbing towards something close to panic, as report after report confirmed that another position had gone dark. Nobody ever found her, because Evelyn Cross had spent 3 years learning exactly how not to be found. She moved across that mountain the way water moves through stone, patient, invisible, following the path of least resistance until the moment came to strike, and then vanishing again before the ripples had even settled. She never allowed herself the luxury of a second shot from any position, understanding that the instant a single round left her rifle, every enemy sensor within range would already be racing to trace its origin. She used the terrain itself as a weapon, choosing firing positions behind natural sound baffles that scattered her muzzle report into a dozen competing echoes, so that even skilled counter-sniper teams found themselves chasing ghosts in every direction except the correct one. Enemy soldiers began refusing to move in the open, even in small groups, a fear spreading through their ranks that no training had prepared them for, because conventional warfare had rules and instincts that this kind of silent, patient hunting simply did not obey. By the time 3 hours had passed since her first shot, the enemy force that had entered that valley with total confidence had lost nearly a third of its effective combat strength, without ever once identifying the source of the threat that was slowly disassembling them. The truth of those 3 missing years began to surface slowly, pieced together later from fragments. Evelyn herself eventually chose to share, though even then she offered only what she believed necessary and nothing more. In the immediate aftermath of that first ambush, the one that had supposedly killed her, she had in fact survived the initial engagement, though survival had come at a devastating cost that nearly finished what the enemy fire had failed to complete. A mortar fragment had shattered the bones in her lower leg during the final minutes of her defense, and blood loss from the wound had left her barely conscious by the time she finally broke contact and began crawling away from her position under cover of the same snowfall that search teams would later blame for hiding her body. She had made it perhaps 2 kilometers before her strength gave out entirely, collapsing into a shallow depression between 2 boulders, where the wind had already begun burying her beneath a layer of fresh snow. She would have died there, quietly and completely forgotten, if not for a small group of nomadic herders who moved seasonally through that region and happened to be driving their animals along a route that passed near enough to notice disturbed snow where none should have existed. They pulled her from that hollow with no idea who she was or what uniform she had once worn beneath her frozen gear, and they carried her back to a settlement so remote it did not appear on most military maps of the region. For months afterward, she drifted between consciousness and fever, her legs set with methods that owed more to generations of practical knowledge than to any modern medical training, her identity known to no one beyond the family who had chosen, for reasons that had nothing to do with politics, simply to save a dying stranger. By the time she was well enough to understand her own situation clearly, the world she had left behind had already buried her, mourned her, and moved on without her. It was during those long months of slow recovery, lying in a small dwelling with nothing to occupy her mind but memory and suspicion, that Evelyn began reconstructing the operation that had nearly killed her, piece by piece, until a pattern emerged that she could no longer dismiss as coincidence. The intelligence that sent her team into that valley had been too specific, too confidently wrong in exactly the ways that would guarantee catastrophic failure, and the timing of enemy reinforcements arriving at that precise location suggested foreknowledge that should not have existed anywhere outside a small circle of senior officers. She began working backward through every briefing, every officer who had touched that mission file, every decision point where the operation could have been quietly compromised by someone with access and motive. What she found, slowly and with mounting certainty, was evidence pointing toward a senior officer within her own command structure, someone with the rank and the access necessary to alter mission parameters without triggering any of the usual safeguards designed to prevent exactly this kind of betrayal. The realization that settled over her during those recovering months was not comfort but calculation, because she understood immediately what would happen if she simply reported back to base and announced that she had survived. If a senior officer had already proven willing to sacrifice an entire team to cover whatever arrangement he had made, then a lone survivor returning with suspicions and no solid proof would represent nothing but a loose end demanding to be tied off permanently. Evelyn made her decision in the quiet of that borrowed home, weighing loyalty to the uniform against loyalty to the truth, and concluding that the two were not, in this particular case, the same thing at all. She chose to remain dead to the world that believed her gone, understanding that a ghost cannot be silenced the way a witness can, and that the only way to expose what had really happened was to disappear completely and build her case from outside the reach of whoever had betrayed her team. For 3 years, she moved like something between a shadow and a rumor, working alone through channels that left no official trail, gathering fragments of financial records, intercepted communications, and quiet conversations with soldiers who had noticed things they were never quite comfortable reporting through normal channels. She learned patience in those years in ways that even her legendary sniper training had never fully taught her, understanding that the truth she was hunting could not be forced into the open, only slowly uncovered through years of careful, invisible work. She took odd jobs under false names in towns far from any base, worked construction in the summer and drove supply trucks in the winter, always listening, always watching, always careful never to stay anywhere long enough to be remembered clearly by anyone who might one day be asked questions about her. There were nights during those years when the isolation nearly broke something in her, when the weight of being presumed dead by people who had once trusted her with their lives pressed down harder than any physical wound she had ever carried into battle. She endured those nights the same way she had endured every difficult moment of her career, by reminding herself that the mission was not yet finished, and that soldiers under her old command deserved a truth that no shortcut or premature confession could ever properly deliver. And now, watching Delta Team fight for survival on a mountain that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the trap that had nearly killed her 3 years earlier, she recognized the pattern immediately for what it truly was. This was not a coincidence of geography or tactics, she realized as she studied the battlefield through her optic from a position no enemy scout had come anywhere close to detecting. The ambush unfolding below her carried the same fingerprints as the one that had ended her official existence, the same too convenient intelligence failure, the same precisely timed enemy reinforcement, the same deliberate sealing of every avenue of retreat before the trapped soldiers even understood they were caught. Someone within command had orchestrated this catastrophe with the same signature, the same careful hand, and Evelyn understood within minutes of opening fire that this operation was never really about capturing a single scientist or eliminating a single Delta team. It was a continuation of something larger, a betrayal that had never stopped after her supposed death, and that meant the traitor she had spent 3 years hunting was very likely still active, still positioned, and still willing to sacrifice entire units to protect whatever arrangement he had built. She began working through the enemy positions with the same unhurried discipline that had once made her the most feared name on any battlefield she operated on, moving between firing positions with a rhythm that never allowed a single location to be used twice, understanding instinctively that predictability was the only thing that could get a sniper killed at her level of skill. She calculated wind drift across the valley by watching how snow lifted off distant ridgelines, adjusted for the thinning air at altitude, and accounted for the way temperature differentials bent her round subtly off the path a simpler calculation would have predicted. Enemy soldiers below began falling at intervals that felt almost rhythmic, one every few minutes, each shot fired from a slightly different angle, each position abandoned within seconds of firing before any counter-battery response could hope to locate her. No enemy operator on that mountain ever managed to identify a pattern in her movement, because there was no pattern to identify beyond the simple rule she had followed for her entire career. One shot, one position, and then gone before the echo finished rolling across the valley. Word of what was happening spread through the enemy ranks with a speed that outpaced any official communication, passed soldier to soldier in tones that carried genuine fear rather than mere professional concern about casualties. "The ghost has returned," someone reportedly said over an intercepted transmission, and within the hour that phrase had spread across the entire operational area, whispered by men who had never believed the old stories were anything more than exaggerated, legend passed down from veterans trying to intimidate recruits. Enemy commanders who had entered that valley with total confidence in their carefully engineered trap began ordering tactical withdrawals within hours, unwilling to continue feeding soldiers into a killing field where the true predator remained completely invisible. What had begun as a certain massacre of Delta Team transformed, shot by shot, into a rout that left the attacking force scattered and demoralized long before any conventional reinforcement could have arrived to change the outcome. Back at forward command, far from the mountain where this reversal was unfolding in real time, Commander Marcus Hale had already begun pulling records. The moment reliable communication was restored, driven by a suspicion he could no longer ignore now that Ghost's return felt increasingly undeniable. He requested archived mission files from 3 years earlier, the operation that had supposedly ended Evelyn Cross's life, cross-referencing personnel assignments, communication logs, and approval signatures with a thoroughness that surprised even the analysts assisting him. What he found, buried beneath layers of routine bureaucratic obscurity, confirmed suspicions that had apparently haunted quiet corners of the intelligence community for years without ever being formally investigated. The mission that killed Evelyn Cross's team had been compromised deliberately, its parameters altered by someone with senior authorization, timed with a precision that could only have come from foreknowledge shared directly with hostile forces. The name attached to those alterations belonged to a general nearing the end of a long and celebrated career, a man named Walter Pierce who had spent decades building a reputation for tactical brilliance that made the accusation almost impossible for Hale to accept at first glance. Further digging revealed a financial relationship between Pierce and a private weapons manufacturing conglomerate that stood to profit enormously from prolonged regional conflict, a relationship structured carefully enough to survive routine audits but not the kind of determined investigation Evelyn had apparently been conducting for 3 years from the shadows. Pierce had, it became clear, orchestrated the original ambush specifically to eliminate Evelyn's team, whose operational success had begun threatening contracts and arrangements worth more to certain interested parties than the lives of the soldiers involved. Commander Hale sat with that information for a long time, feeling something between fury and grief settle over him as he understood the full weight of what had actually happened 3 years earlier, and what very nearly happened again today. He understood, with a clarity that made his stomach turn, exactly why Evelyn Cross had chosen to remain dead rather than return through official channels the moment she recovered from her injuries. A general with Pierce's rank and reputation, faced with a surviving witness capable of exposing his arrangement with weapons contractors profiting from prolonged war, would have found a dozen quiet ways to ensure that witness never spoke publicly. Evelyn had understood that danger instinctively, had weighed her own survival against the risk of walking back into a system that had already proven willing to sacrifice her entire team, and had chosen the only path that gave her any real chance of eventually exposing the truth. Hale felt something close to shame settle over him as he considered how close the system had come to failing her twice, how easily her sacrifice could have been buried permanently if she had made the mistake of trusting the wrong people with her survival. He gathered his findings quietly over the following day, sharing them only with 2 investigators he trusted completely, both of whom had served long enough to understand the danger of moving too loudly against a man with Pierce's connections and reputation. The financial records told a story that was almost elegant in its patience, a series of consulting fees and advisory payments routed through shell arrangements over nearly 6 years, each transaction small enough to avoid triggering automatic review, each one timed to follow closely behind a military decision that had somehow always benefited the same weapons manufacturer. Hale cross-referenced troop deployment schedules against contract renewal dates and found a correlation that no honest coincidence could explain, a pattern of prolonged engagements and delayed peace negotiations that had generated enormous profit for a company Pierce had quietly advised for years before ever formally retiring from active command. It was, Hale realized with a growing and cold anger, not merely one betrayal but a career built on betrayal, a slow accumulation of decisions that had cost soldiers their lives in order to keep a profitable war extended just long enough to serve interests that had nothing to do with the country either man had sworn to protect. Word came through intercepted communications within hours that General Pierce, having learned somehow that his arrangement was unraveling and that Evelyn Cross's investigation had finally reached people willing to act on it, was preparing to flee the region entirely rather than face the consequences of what he had orchestrated. A helicopter was readied at a remote airstrip normally reserved for high-priority logistics transport, its manifest quietly altered to list Pierce as essential personnel being evacuated ahead of a supposed security threat that existed only in the fabricated report he had filed to justify his own escape. Evelyn learned of this development through channels she had spent years cultivating precisely for moments like this one, and she understood immediately that if Pierce reached international airspace before anyone could act, the truth she had sacrificed 3 years to uncover would likely never see daylight in any court that mattered. She repositioned herself with the same unhurried precision that had defined every movement across that long and brutal day, climbing to an elevation that offered a narrow but usable line of sight toward the airstrip where Pierce's helicopter was already beginning its final preparations for departure. The distance to the target, Once she settled into position and ranged it through her optic, measured out to 4,600 meters, a figure so far beyond any reasonable expectation of accuracy that even Evelyn allowed herself a long moment of careful calculation before committing to the shot. Wind at that altitude was gusting unpredictably, shifting direction twice in the span of a single minute, conditions that would have made the shot effectively impossible for any sniper without her particular combination of training, instinct, and years of hard-earned patience. She watched the helicopter's rotor begin spinning up, understood that she had perhaps 30 seconds before it lifted beyond any hope of a clean shot, and made the calculation that every instructor who had ever trained under her legendary reputation would later study for years afterward. She drew a slow breath, feeling the wind against her cheek shift one final time in a pattern she had watched build for the better part of a minute, and released it halfway before her fingers settled against the trigger with the stillness that had made her name feared across every battlefield she had ever worked. The shot traveled across nearly 3 miles of mountain air, bending subtly with the wind exactly as she had calculated, arriving at the helicopter's tail rotor assembly at the precise fraction of a second she had intended. The impact shattered the rotor mechanism instantly, sending the aircraft into a violent, uncontrolled spin that the pilot fought desperately to correct, ultimately managing only an emergency landing rather than the catastrophic crash that a less skilled pilot would certainly have suffered. Ground forces loyal to Commander Hale, already moving on Evelyn's earlier warning about Pierce's planned escape, reached the crash site within minutes and took the general into custody before he could destroy the documentation still stored on the encrypted drive he had been carrying with him. Nobody died in that final confrontation, who was not already an active combatant in the fighting that had consumed the mountain throughout that long day, a distinction that mattered greatly to Evelyn, who had spent her entire career drawing careful lines between necessary force and unnecessary cruelty. Pierce survived the crash with nothing worse than a broken collarbone, an outcome that struck many observers afterward as almost unbearably merciful given the scale of the betrayal he had orchestrated across 3 years and countless lives. But mercy had never been the point for Evelyn Cross, not that day and not across the years of quiet investigation that preceded it. The point had always been the truth, delivered intact and undeniable, in a form that no cover-up or influential friend could ever again bury the way her own supposed death had once been buried. In the days that followed the operation, once the full scope of General Pierce's betrayal had been documented and confirmed through the evidence recovered from his crashed helicopter, the government moved with unusual speed to correct a record that had stood uncorrected for 3 long years. Officials confirmed publicly what Commander Hale and a small circle of investigators already understood privately, that Evelyn Cross had never betrayed her uniform, had never abandoned her post, and had never done anything except survive an assassination attempt disguised as a battlefield tragedy. The years she spent in hiding were reframed not as desertion but as the only viable strategy available to a lone witness facing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military leadership. Her name, removed quietly from active status and etched instead into a memorial for the fallen, was restored to the roles of active service with an official correction that acknowledged, in careful bureaucratic language, an error that had cost her 3 years of her life, and nearly cost her everything else besides. A ceremony was arranged to formally reinstate her honors, a modest affair held at Fort Ridgeline rather than the elaborate public spectacle that some officials had initially proposed, out of respect for a woman who had never once, in her entire career, shown any appetite for public attention or applause. Medals that had been quietly withdrawn upon her presumed death were formally returned to her, along with new commendations recognizing the extraordinary skill and discipline she had demonstrated during the operation that finally exposed Pierce's betrayal to the world. Commander Hale stood near the front of that small gathering, watching a woman he had once mourned as a fallen legend receive recognition that felt, in some ways, almost too small for what she had actually endured and accomplished across 3 impossible years. She accepted the honors with the same quiet composure that had defined every account anyone had ever given of her, offering no speech, no extended remarks, nothing beyond a brief and simple acknowledgement of the ceremony itself. Evelyn did not remain at the base once the formalities concluded, slipping away from the gathering with the same practiced ease she had used to vanish from countless battlefields throughout her career before any journalist or official could corner her for a statement she clearly had no intention of giving. She answered no interview requests in the days that followed, offered no extended account of her 3 years in hiding beyond what investigators required for the official record, and made clear through her actions rather than her words that she considered the matter closed the moment the truth had been established. Commander Hale watched her walk away from the base that final afternoon, moving toward the tree line with the unhurried, purposeful gait of someone who had never needed anyone's permission to disappear. He found himself smiling slightly despite the solemnity of everything they had all just endured together, understanding something about her that he suspected very few people ever fully grasp. "Legends do not need applause," he said quietly to no one in particular, watching her figure grow smaller against the distant line of dark trees until she finally passed beyond his sight entirely. The observation felt true in a way that went beyond simple sentiment, capturing something essential about a woman who had spent her entire career operating in silence, achieving results that spoke for themselves without ever requiring recognition or ceremony to validate their significance. Whatever Evelyn Cross had sacrificed across those 3 hidden years, whatever cost that silence had extracted from her personally, she had never once sought credit for enduring it, choosing instead to let the truth arrive in its own time and speak entirely for itself. Weeks later, on a different mountain far from Black Ridge, in weather every bit as unforgiving as the storm that had once nearly claimed her life, Evelyn Cross knelt at the edge of a rocky outcrop and studied a distant horizon through the scope of a rifle she had carried for longer than most careers in the service typically lasted. The valley below her stretched empty and silent, no target in sight, no mission currently active, only the vast quiet of high-altitude terrain and the particular stillness that had always felt more like home to her than any barracks or briefing room ever had. Her radio crackled softly against her shoulder, carrying a transmission she had half expected might come eventually, though she had not known exactly when or from whom. "Ghost," the voice said, steady and familiar. "We may need you again." Evelyn lowered her scope slightly, allowed the faintest trace of a smile to cross her weathered features, and said nothing at all in response, because some answers were always better delivered through action than through words.